The morning sun filtered through the expansive glass windows of Boston Prestige Motors, a high-end luxury car dealership nestled just off Commonwealth Avenue. Inside, polished marble floors gleamed under the overhead lights, reflecting the sleek curves of Porsches, Bentleys, Ferraris, and one particularly striking midnight blue coupe perched on a raised platform. The kind of showroom where buyers arrived with private bankers and left with champagne toasts. At 9:47 a.m., the front doors swung open, and in walked Maggie Collins. She didn't arrive in a chauffeured SUV or draped in designer labels. Instead, she wore a plain white t-shirt, a pair of worn Levi's jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. Her curly hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and she carried no handbag, just her car keys and a quiet confidence that came from living life on her own terms. To the sales manager Brad Whitman, that confidence was invisible. From across the room, he caught sight of her and raised an eyebrow. "Here we go again," he muttered to a colleague, straightening his blue silk tie. Brad prided himself on his ability to spot real buyers, the kind who knew how to dress the part. Into him, Maggie screamed window shopper. He watched as she made her way toward the midnight blue coupe, the limited edition Azure. With only 15 of them made nationwide, its $285,000 price tag made it one of the showroom's crown jewels. Before Maggie could reach the car, a young salesman named Eric Sanders, fresh out of college and still learning the ropes, greeted her with a friendly smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to Boston Prestige Motors. Is there something you'd like to take a closer look at?" "Yes," Maggie said kindly, pointing toward the Azure. "I'd love to know more about that one." But before Eric could respond, Brad swooped in, cutting him off with the ease of someone used to taking control. "Thanks, Eric. I'll take it from here." Turning to Maggie, he forced a tight-lipped smile. "Ma'am, I think you might be more comfortable at our pre-owned lot. It's about 3 blocks east. These vehicles," he gestured broadly, "start at around $300,000. A few staff members chuckled quietly from behind a desk. Customers glanced over, sensing the shift in mood. Maggie's cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from the sting of being judged yet again by someone who only saw the surface. She stood tall, her tone calm. "I'm actually interested in this model as a gift." Brad's expression barely masked his skepticism. "I'm afraid that particular model is by appointment only. For serious buyers." Without another word, Maggie nodded and walked out under the judgmental eyes of those who thought she didn't belong. But what they didn't realize was this: she wasn't the one out of place. The Collins estate sat quietly on 5 tree-lined acres just outside Boston, a world away from the marble and glass showroom Maggie had walked out of that morning. Unlike the ostentatious mansions in certain zip codes, the Collins home was intentionally understated, colonial-style architecture, a wraparound porch, and a garden she tended herself. From the outside, no one would guess that billions were behind its foundation. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the kitchen as Maggie stepped into her husband's study. David Collins, founder and CEO of one of the country's most innovative renewable energy companies, was hunched over a series of technical blueprints. At 41, he had quietly built a fortune by transforming how Americans stored solar and wind energy, making off-grid living more than a dream for thousands of families. But the moment he saw Maggie's expression, he set everything aside. "What happened?" he asked, crossing the room in 2 strides. She eased into the leather armchair by the fireplace, the emotional weight of her morning settling over her like a heavy coat. "It was educational," she said with a wry smile. As she recounted the encounter at Boston Prestige Motors, the sneering looks, the dismissive tone, the laughter of the staff, David listened without interrupting. He didn't need to ask how it made her feel. After 15 years of marriage, he knew how deeply it wounded her to see others treated unfairly, even more so when it happened to her. "It's not about me," she concluded softly. "I have the luxury of walking away, knowing the truth about what I can afford." But how many people get treated like that every single day, and don't have that comfort? To the outside world, Maggie Collins was just another casually dressed woman. But behind the modest appearance stood the heart and mind behind the Collins Foundation, one of New England's most respected nonprofits supporting children with disabilities. She had built it from the ground up, starting in a church basement with nothing but an idea and a master's degree in special education. Over the past decade, the foundation had raised more than $50 million, funding physical therapy centers, adaptive sports programs, and scholarships for families who couldn't afford specialized care. She had been recognized by the governor's office and even invited to speak at the White House, but she never advertised those accolades. For Maggie, the work wasn't about prestige. It was about impact. She could afford any car she wanted. But she dressed simply, not to hide her wealth, but to stay grounded in the values she held dear: humility, compassion, and integrity. David knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "So, what do you want to do about it?" Part of her wanted to forget the whole thing. But another part, the deeper part, knew this was bigger than her. "I don't want revenge," she said. "But I do want them to learn something. Especially that young man, Eric. He treated me with respect when no one else did." David's eyes lit with quiet resolve. "Then let's make sure they remember this. Not just today, but for a long time to come." As the late afternoon sun dipped low over the Collins estate, the quiet stillness inside the study stood in sharp contrast to Maggie's restless thoughts. She sat on the edge of the couch, sipping a fresh cup of chamomile tea, while David paced slowly near the fireplace, hands in his pockets, his expression contemplative. Maggie had never been one for drama. She didn't need revenge, and she certainly didn't want to make a spectacle. But what had happened at the dealership earlier that day had struck a deeper nerve, not just because it had happened to her, but because it happened to countless people every day, dismissed because of how they looked, how they dressed, or where they came from. David finally broke the silence. "I could buy the dealership tomorrow. Fire that guy. Restructure the whole thing from the inside out." Maggie gave him a tired smile. "You could. But that would just confirm everything they already think, that power solves everything." David chuckled softly. "You're right. Too obvious. And not your style." She nodded. "What I want is for them to realize what they did. To feel it. Not out of shame, but because they understand. I want a lesson, not punishment." David sat across from her and leaned forward. "Then we'll give them one they won't forget." Together, they began crafting a plan, not fueled by anger, but by intention. Maggie didn't need to embarrass anyone. But she wanted people like Brad Whitman, the smug sales manager, to see beyond labels, beyond clothing, beyond assumptions. The idea was simple, yet powerful. David would visit the dealership the next morning, no appointment, no announcement. He would arrive in his custom Rolls Royce Phantom, a vehicle so rare it turned heads even in Beverly Hills. A vehicle worth well over $1.2 million. Every inch of it bespoke wealth, from the custom midnight blue paint that shimmered in the sun to the extended wheelbase and white-gloved chauffeur. He would walk in not as a show of force, but as a mirror, reflecting back the very behavior they had displayed. He would ask about the same car Maggie had inquired about, the Azure Coupe. And then, calmly, he would reveal the truth. Not just that Maggie was his wife. Not just that she could have paid for every car in the showroom. But that her kindness, grace, and generosity outweighed all the showroom polish in the world. He would make sure the young salesman, Eric, was recognized for his respectful conduct. And if the dealership was willing to listen, David would propose something greater, a partnership in education and social awareness. Maggie smiled as David outlined the plan. Subtle. Dignified. Effective, she said. He raised an eyebrow. You sure you don't want to come? She shook her head. I don't need to be there. But I do expect a detailed report, she added with a wink. The wheels of justice were now turning, not with fury, but with purpose. And the next morning, Boston Prestige Motors would never be the same. The next morning at Boston Prestige Motors started like any other. The scent of polished leather and high-end car wax lingered in the air. Sales staff moved with the familiar rhythm of luxury retail, smiles rehearsed, shoes shined, suits tailored. Brad Whitman, the sales manager, gathered his team in the center of the showroom floor for a short pep talk. Remember, he said, straightening his signature blue tie, we cater to a certain clientele. If someone walks in off the street in sneakers and jeans, send them to the pre-owned lot. No more wasted time. A few team members chuckled, recalling the woman from the day before. But that smug energy dissolved at precisely 10:17 a.m., when the distant purr of a powerful engine grew louder, then stopped just outside the front entrance. The showroom went still. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a Rolls Royce Phantom pulled up to the curb. Not just any Phantom, this one was custom-built, a deep, shifting midnight blue that seemed to change hue depending on how the morning light touched it. Its chrome accents gleamed like silver. The extended wheelbase hinted at bespoke craftsmanship, and the white-gloved chauffeur stepped out with the grace of a butler from a fine estate in Newport. Every head turned. Even Brad, who considered himself unshakable, stood straighter. That's got to be a seven-figure build, he murmured. The chauffeur circled to the rear door and opened it with care. Out stepped a tall, confident man in a tailored charcoal suit, his salt and pepper hair styled with intention, his presence commanding. No flashy jewelry. No entourage. Just a quiet power in the way he walked, like someone used to being listened to. David Collins crossed the showroom threshold as if he owned the place. And for a moment, it felt like he just might. Brad moved quickly, cutting in before any other salesman could approach. Good morning, sir. Welcome to Boston Prestige Motors. Brad Whitman, sales manager. How can we assist you today? David offered a polite but measured smile. I'm here to look at the Azure Coupe. Midnight blue. My wife was interested in it yesterday. Brad's expression brightened, the scent of commission hanging in the air. A fine choice, sir. You said your wife was here? I don't believe I had the pleasure of assisting her. David stopped walking and faced him directly. His voice lowered, not in volume, but in tone, firm, precise. Oh, I believe you did, Mr. Whitman. Yesterday. She was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. You sent her away. It hit like a thunderclap. Brad blinked. The blood drained from his face. Behind him, Eric, the young salesman, froze mid-step. A few staff members shifted uncomfortably. My name is David Collins, he continued. And that woman you dismissed? She's my wife, Maggie Collins. She walked out of here humiliated. The air in the room shifted. It was no longer a sales floor. It was a courtroom. And Brad Whitman had just been called to account. For a long moment, the only sound inside Boston Prestige Motors was the soft hum of the climate control system. The typically bustling showroom had fallen into a hush, stunned by David Collins' revelation. His calm voice had cut deeper than any raised tone ever could. Across the polished marble floor, Brad Whitman stood frozen, his once confident posture unraveling before everyone's eyes. The man who had, just hours earlier, prided himself on qualifying customers by their clothes, now stood exposed, his judgment laid bare for all to see. I must have been mistaken, Brad stammered, grasping for control. We see a lot of foot traffic. But David didn't let him off that easily. No. You weren't mistaken. You judged her based on how she looked. You assumed she didn't belong. There it was. The truth, out in the open. Behind the front desk, Eric Sanders, the youngest member of the sales team, fidgeted with the corner of a brochure. He had stayed quiet long enough, his conscience heavy from the day before. While he hadn't joined in the mocking or turned Maggie away, he also hadn't stepped in when Brad dismissed her, not really. Until now. With a quick breath, Eric stepped forward, his voice a little shaky but clear. Mr. Collins, he said, if I may. All eyes turned to him. I was there yesterday, Eric continued. Your wife was nothing but respectful. She asked about the Azure, was interested in buying it, and she was turned away. Not because she said something wrong, but because of how she was dressed. Brad shot him a glare, but Eric didn't waver. She asked me questions about the car, and I tried to help, but Mr. Whitman, Eric hesitated for just a moment, then stood taller. Mr. Whitman shut it down. He told her the car was by appointment only. But then, not 5 minutes later, he opened the same car for another couple, just because they were wearing designer clothes. The room was silent again, but this time, there was a shift, a quiet admiration for the young man who had found the courage to speak. David nodded slowly. Thank you, Eric. It takes integrity to tell the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable. At that moment, Charles Bennett, the dealership's owner, appeared from his office. He had overheard enough to piece things together. His face, usually reserved and composed, now showed clear concern. I'd like to speak privately with you, Mr. Collins, he offered. In a moment, David replied, eyes still on Eric. This young man did the right thing. He should be recognized for that. Eric swallowed hard, visibly overwhelmed. It wasn't the most comfortable spotlight, but it was the right one. And in that moment, surrounded by senior colleagues and high-end clients, Eric Sanders reminded everyone that character isn't about age, salary, or suit size. It's about doing what's right when it matters most. The tension inside Boston Prestige Motors lingered like a heavy fog. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the luxury vehicles, normally the stars of the showroom, seemed to fade into the background as David Collins stood calmly in the center of the floor, holding the room in quiet judgment. Brad Whitman, once so confident and self-assured, now looked pale, his carefully styled hair slightly askew and his polished shoes suddenly too loud on the marble tile as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. But David hadn't come to destroy reputations. He wasn't interested in public shaming. His voice remained measured as he turned toward Charles Bennett, the dealership's owner, who had just arrived, clearly rattled. I'm not here to make threats, Mr. Bennett, David began. And I don't want an apology given just to protect your brand. What I want, what my wife and I both want, is for people to start seeing beyond appearances. Charles swallowed hard and nodded. Of course, Mr. Collins. We take this very seriously. What happened yesterday does not reflect our values. David raised an eyebrow. Values aren't what you write in a mission statement. They're what you tolerate in silence. A beat of silence followed, Then David continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. My wife came here hoping to buy the Azure Coupe as a gift for her sister. Not that it's your business, but her sister recently beat stage 3 breast cancer. That car wasn't just a luxury, it was a celebration of survival. And yet she walked out of here feeling small. Even Brad's expression softened as the words landed. I was planning to buy more than just that car, David added. Our foundation rotates company vehicles every few years. 7 in total, plus 2 for my personal collection. But I'm not here to dangle business like a prize. I'm here to offer something else. A few staff members glanced up, surprised. David looked directly at Brad. You're going to volunteer at our next Collins Foundation event. It's a benefit gala for adaptive sports programs, wheelchair basketball, swimming, track. You'll be helping set up, assisting guests, and spending time with kids who've been judged far too often in their lives. Brad opened his mouth, but no sound came out. David continued, and Mr. Bennett, I suggest your team consider diversity and empathy training. I know several qualified consultants who specialize in helping businesses uncover unconscious bias. I'd be happy to connect you. Charles nodded slowly, sensing a second chance, not just to save face, but to grow. And the Azure Coupe? Brad asked quietly, almost as if hoping there was still room for redemption. David smiled slightly and turned to Eric. Eric will handle the paperwork. Starting today. A ripple of stunned surprise went through the room, but not from anger. From realization. This wasn't just about one car or one insult. This was about transformation. And for some, that began with the hardest lesson of all, looking in the mirror and deciding to become someone better. 1 month had passed since the confrontation at Boston Prestige Motors, but for Brad Whitman, it felt like a lifetime. Gone were the tailored suits and designer cufflinks. Tonight, Brad wore a navy blue volunteer polo with the Collins Foundation logo stitched over the heart, paired with khaki slacks and sensible shoes. Instead of polished floors and gleaming Bentleys, he now stood in the grand ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel, helping guide guests to their tables and handing out event programs. The Collins Foundation Benefit Gala was in full swing, an elegant evening filled with hope and humanity. The room buzzed with laughter, live jazz music, and the joyful energy of families whose children had found belonging through adaptive sports programs. Large screens displayed photos of kids racing in wheelchairs, swimming with prosthetic limbs, and scoring baskets on lowered hoops. For many in the room, this wasn't just a charity event. It was a celebration of resilience. Brad was still adjusting. At first, he had treated the volunteer assignment as a punishment, a PR move to save his position and reputation. But somewhere between helping a young girl navigate the banquet hall on her walker and tying balloons for a boy with limited mobility, something began to shift. Tonight, as he knelt to help a boy named Thomas adjust the straps on his specialized basketball wheelchair, Brad felt something he hadn't expected: gratitude. Not pity, not discomfort. Just a quiet appreciation for being part of something that actually mattered. From across the room, Maggie Collins, elegant in a simple dark blue dress, watched the interaction. She saw the change, not just in how Brad moved, but in his demeanor. He wasn't performing. He was participating. Later in the evening, as guests mingled near the silent auction tables, Maggie approached Brad. He stood and turned, a bit nervously, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "thank you for letting me be part of this." She smiled. "How are you finding the experience so far?" Brad paused, searching for the right words. "Humbling. And overdue." Maggie nodded thoughtfully. "Thomas seems to like you." Brad chuckled. He told me I'd dribble like a nervous squirrel. That sounds about right, Maggie said with a grin. Then Brad's expression turned serious. I know I gave you a formal apology, but I need to say it again, person to person. I was wrong. Not just in how I treated you, but in how I viewed people in general. I made snap judgments, and I thought I was good at it. But I wasn't. I was just shallow. Maggie didn't interrupt. She let the silence hold space. I'm trying to do better now, Brad added. Not just because I have to, but because I want to. You're off to a good start, Maggie replied gently. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being aware. And then doing something with that awareness. Brad nodded, a little overwhelmed. He had once stood tall on marble floors, confident in his own importance. Now, kneeling beside a child in a wheelchair, he'd finally begun to understand what true character looked like. As the final notes of the jazz quartet faded into the soft hum of conversation and clinking dessert forks, the Collins Foundation Gala began to wind down. Guests hugged, laughed, and posed for photos beneath the navy and gold banner that read, "Empowering every child, one step at a time." Near the back of the ballroom, Brad Whitman stood beside a photo booth, helping Thomas, the sharp-witted boy in the wheelchair, adjust his tie for a family picture. "You're pretty cool for a grown-up," Thomas said with a grin. Brad laughed, genuinely this time. "Coming from you, that means a lot." Not long ago, Brad had measured success by car sales and commissions. He had judged people by the brands on their shoes and the watches on their wrists. But tonight, in a crowded ballroom filled with children, families, and community heroes, he found himself seeing the world through a new lens. Across the room, Maggie Collins stood beside her husband, David, thanking donors and chatting warmly with guests. They didn't boast about their wealth. They didn't need to. Their presence was grounded, sincere. Maggie's quiet leadership and deep compassion had touched everyone in the room, and Brad now understood why David had walked into the dealership that morning not to punish, but to open a door. When Brad approached the couple, he carried not a business card, but something more meaningful, a sense of purpose. "I just wanted to thank you both," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "This foundation, this experience, it's changed me. More than I thought possible." David nodded. "We've heard good things. Eric tells us you've been mentoring him at the dealership." Brad smiled faintly. "He's a quick study. Probably a better man than I was at his age." "Well," Maggie said, "it sounds like you've become someone worth learning from." Brad hesitated, then added, "I'd like to keep volunteering with the adaptive sports program, if that's okay. I want to keep this going." David extended his hand. "We'd be honored to have you." As they shook hands, Maggie added with a knowing smile, "Oh, and that corporate fleet David mentioned a while back? We're still in the market. If you're ready." Brad blinked, surprised. "You want me to handle it?" "You've earned it," David said simply. It wasn't just a sale. It was a second chance. A statement of trust. Later that evening, as Brad helped stack chairs and fold tablecloths, he watched as Maggie knelt beside a girl in a walker, listening to her as if she were the most important person in the room. No cameras. No speeches. Just presence. That was real wealth, Brad realized, not what you drive or wear, but how you treat people when no one important is watching. He'd misjudged her once. But tonight, he saw her clearly, and in doing so, he'd begun to see himself. As we get older, we often reflect on the things that truly matter: kindness, respect, and the way we treat one another. This story reminds us that wealth, titles, and appearances can be deceiving, but character always reveals itself over time. Maggie Collins, though modest in appearance, carried immense inner strength, compassion, and purpose. She wasn't seeking validation, only fairness. Her quiet dignity in the face of prejudice teaches us that true grace doesn't shout, it simply stands firm. And Brad Whitman, once blinded by superficial judgment, discovered humility through experience, not by punishment, but by being given a chance to understand and grow. In life, we all have moments when we're quick to judge. But the older we get, the more we realize, the most valuable people are often the ones who expect no recognition at all. Whether in a showroom, a church pew, or a neighborhood cafe, we are reminded that everyone deserves respect, until they give us a reason to believe otherwise. So let us lead by example, not just with our words, but with our actions. Because sometimes, the greatest lessons come when we simply choose to see each other more clearly.